Moscow, February, 1991. The winter outside is brutal, but it is nothing compared to the chill inside the Kremlin. The wind howls through the empty streets of a capital that is slowly losing its soul. But down here deep within, the windowless bunkers of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the air is still and heavy. It smells of stale coffee. It smells of cheap Belomorkanal cigarettes. And more than anything else, it smells of fear. Picture the room. Dark wood paneling that has seen better days, maps of the world covering every inch of the walls. And sitting around a massive oak table are men with chests full of medals. These are not politicians. These are the marshals of the Soviet Union. Men who remember the Great Patriotic War. Men who believe in steel and blood. For decades, they have slept soundly at night because they believed in one simple truth. They believed that the Red Army was the greatest power on Earth. They believed that if World War III ever happened, their tanks would roll across Europe like an unstoppable iron tide. They exported this belief to their greatest ally in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein. Iraq was not just a client state. It was a fortress built on Soviet blueprints. It was a mirror image of the Red Army. Thousands of T-72 tanks, the best air defense systems money could buy. A wall of missiles and radar designed to turn the sky into a meat grinder. The generals in this room are waiting for reports of victory. They are waiting to hear how American jets are falling from the sky. They are waiting to prove that their technology is superior. But then the telex machine in the corner starts to chatter. Click, click, click. It is a sound that cuts through the smoke like a knife. A young aide trembling in his oversized uniform tears the paper from the machine. He reads it. His face goes pale. He does not want to hand it to the Minister of Defense, but he has no choice. The report does not speak of victory. It does not even speak of a battle. It speaks of a massacre. Let us leave that cold room in Moscow for a moment. Let us transport ourselves to the burning sands of the Kuwaiti border. Imagine you are an Iraqi tank commander. You are a veteran. You have fought against Iran for 8 years. You are not easily scared. You are sitting inside the turret of a T-72 tank. This machine is your home. It is your castle. You are surrounded by 20 tons of composite armor. You feel safe. You know that the American M1 Abrams tanks are miles away. You know that if an American jet tries to fly high to drop a bomb, your radar will see it and your missiles will kill it. The desert is silent. The heat waves shimmer off the sand. Then you hear it. It is not the roar of a supersonic jet. It is not the scream of a missile. It is a low, dull whine, like a vacuum cleaner in the distance. It is slow. It is almost lazy. You look through your periscope, and your blood runs cold. Coming out of the smoke is a shape that does not belong in the modern world. It is not a sleek silver arrow like an F-16. It is dark. It is ugly. It has straight wings like a plane from your grandfather's war. It has 2 massive engines sitting high on its tail like strange tumors. It is flying so low that you can almost see the pilot's helmet. You shout orders to your gunner. Fire. Fire everything. This is where the nightmare begins. This is where the laws of physics seem to break down. Your unit opens fire. The ZSU-23 anti-aircraft tanks unleash a river of fire into the sky. Thousands of rounds per minute. You see the tracers hit the plane. You see sparks fly off its wings. You see smoke. In any other war, and with any other plane, that would be the end. A modern jet is a fragile thing. It is a computer with wings. A single bullet in the wrong place, and it explodes. But this thing, this dark cross in the sky, it does not explode. It does not spin out of control. It does not even flinch. It absorbs the bullets. It eats the fire. And then, scene 13, It dips its nose toward you. For a split second, there is silence, and then the world ends. It is a sound that cannot be described with words, but every survivor remembers it. It is not a bang. It is a tear. It sounds like the sky itself is being ripped open by the hands of an angry god. The sound is so loud it vibrates your teeth. It liquefies your bowels before you can even process the noise. The tank next to you simply ceases to exist. It doesn't just catch fire, it shatters. The 40-ton turret is tossed into the air like a plastic toy. The ammunition inside detonates instantly, and then, as the smoke clears, you see the plane pulling up. It turns slowly, almost arrogantly. It is coming back. Back in Moscow, the generals are reading this report in stunned silence. They pass the paper around the table. They look at the translation. "Are you sure this is correct?" one marshal asks, his voice trembling with rage. The report says they hit it. It says they saw pieces of the wing fall off. Why is it not dead? The translator swallows hard. "Comrade General," the Iraqi commander says. He says the monster shrugged. This is the moment the fear sets in. The Soviet military doctrine was built on math. If a missile hits a plane, the plane dies. It is a binary equation. 1 + 1 = 2. But the reports flooding in from the desert are describing an equation that makes no sense. They tell stories of a slow-moving predator that loiters over the battlefield for hours. The Iraqi soldiers have stopped calling it a plane. They call it the Whispering Death. They call it the Ghost. One intercepted radio transmission from a Republican Guard unit captures the horror perfectly. "We hit it with a missile," the voice screams over the static. "We hit it with an Igla shoulder-fired rocket. The engine exploded. It was on fire. We cheered. We thought it was over, but it didn't fall. It just kept flying. And the pilot turned around and killed us all." Silence descends on the Kremlin. The smoke from the cigarettes hangs heavy and still. Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, stands up. He walks to the map of the Middle East. He realizes that something fundamental has changed. They prepared for a war of speed. They prepared for a war of electronics and high-altitude dogfights. They did not prepare for a brute. "What is it?" he whispers. "Find out what it is made of. Find out why it refuses to die." At that moment, they did not know that they were not facing a new technology. They were facing a philosophy. They were facing a machine built by men who expected to be shot. And they were facing a pilot culture so insane, so recklessly brave, that it would shatter the very foundation of the Soviet Empire. The investigation had begun, and the answer would be more terrifying than they could ever imagine. The order goes out from the Kremlin. It is stamped top secret. It travels through encrypted channels from Moscow to the Soviet embassy in Baghdad. The KGB Directorate of Scientific and Technical Intelligence is mobilized. Their mission is simple yet desperate. Find out what that aircraft is. Find out why it does not burn. And bring us the wreckage. The Soviet analysts begin to scour their archives. They are looking for a secret weapon. They are looking for something advanced, something that smells of the 21st century. They dig up old intelligence files from the 1970s. They find grainy black and white surveillance photos of a competition between two American companies, Northrop and Fairchild Republic. They find references to a project codenamed A-X. When the senior engineers at the Sukhoi Design Bureau, the men who built the legendary flankers, finally lay eyes on the specifications of the A-10, they are confused. And then they start to laugh. This? A senior analyst scoffs, throwing the photo onto the table. This is what is killing our tanks? It looks like a joke. To the Soviet eye, the A-10 is an abomination. The Soviet Union spent billions of rubles perfecting the art of speed. Their MiG-25 could fly at 3 times the speed of sound to outrun missiles. Their bombers flew in the stratosphere. They believed that in modern warfare, if you are slow, you are dead. And here was the American A-10. Scene 21. It had no radar in its nose. It had no afterburners. It had straight wings that looked like they were stolen from a World War II prop plane. It was ugly. It was clumsy. It was slower than a commercial airliner. The Soviet assessment was brutal and short. They wrote in their report that in a high-intensity conflict against Soviet air defenses, the A-10 would have a life expectancy of less than 5 minutes. It was a target drone, a flying coffin. But the battlefield does not care about assessments. The battlefield cares about results. And the coffin was killing everything in its path. The laughter in the KGB offices stops abruptly on a rainy Tuesday in the second week of the air campaign. A Soviet electronic intelligence unit stationed near the Iraqi border intercepts a radio transmission that changes everything. It captures the raw, unfiltered reality of American air power, and it reveals the secret that the Soviets had missed. The intercept is from a flight of 2 A-10s, call sign Sandy. They are deep behind enemy lines, operating in what the pilots call the kill box. The Iraqi radar operators have trapped them. A Soviet-made SA-16 missile, a vicious heat-seeking weapon designed to tear the wing off a fighter jet, locks onto the lead aircraft. The Soviet listeners put on their headphones. They lean in. They expect to hear the panic. They expect to hear the frantic beeping of the crash beacon. Boom! The missile hits. The explosion is confirmed by the radar signature blooming on the screen. The aircraft loses altitude violently. It drops 1,000 feet in seconds. Target destroyed, the Iraqi liaison shouts. But the voice in the headphones tells a different story. It is the voice of the American pilot, and it sends a chill down the spine of the Soviet intelligence officer listening in the dark. The pilot is not screaming. He is not praying. He sounds annoyed. He sounds like a man whose car has broken down on the way to work. "I have taken a hit," the pilot says. His breathing is heavy but controlled. "I have lost PC-1 hydraulic pressure. I have lost PC-2 hydraulic pressure. My stick is dead. The plane is drifting right." The Soviet translators freeze. They look at the technical manuals. PC-1 and PC-2 are the primary and secondary hydraulic systems. In a modern jet, like the F-16 or the Soviet MiG-29, hydraulic fluid is the blood of the machine. It moves the flaps. It moves the rudder. It moves the elevators. Without hydraulics, a modern jet is just a falling rock. The computer cannot fly it. The pilot cannot fly it. Physics demands that it crashes. But the pilot continues to speak. "Attempting to engage manual reversion," he says. "Stand by." Manual reversion. The phrase hangs in the air of the briefing room in Moscow like a ghost. The generals demand an explanation. "What is manual reversion?" they ask. "Is it a backup computer? Is it an AI system?" The engineers shake their heads. "No, Comrade General," they whisper. "It is not a computer." They pull out a schematic of the A-10. They point to a series of lines running deep inside the belly of the aircraft. It is a bicycle chain. The room goes silent. They cannot believe it. In the age of microchips and lasers, the Americans had built a fail-safe so primitive it belonged in the 19th century. When the hydraulics fail, the A-10 pilot flips a switch. He disconnects the sleek modern controls. and he connects the control stick directly to steel cables and pulleys that run all the way to the tail of the plane. Suddenly, the pilot is not flying a jet. He is wrestling a 15-ton monster. Imagine the scene inside that cockpit. The plane is full of holes. One engine is smoking. The hydraulics are gone, which means the power steering is gone. The air is rushing over the wings with the force of a hurricane resisting every movement. To turn the plane, the pilot has to use pure, brute, physical strength. He has to pull the stick with both hands, his muscles screaming, his veins popping in his neck just to keep the wings level. He is fighting the wind. He is fighting gravity. He is flying the plane home on sheer willpower. The Soviet intelligence officers listen to the tape. They hear the pilot grunting with exertion. They hear the strain in his voice as he physically forces the shattered machine to turn north, back towards safety. "I have control," the pilot gasps. She is heavy, but she is flying. This was the moment the Soviets realized they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had judged the American military by their own standards. The Soviet system was rigid, it was centralized. Their pilots were trained to follow orders from the ground. Their machines were built to be flown by computers because they did not trust the man in the seat. But the Americans had built a machine that trusted the pilot completely. They had designed a plane that assumed failure was inevitable. They knew it would get shot. They knew the computers would fry. They knew the hydraulics would bleed out. So they built a system that allowed a single human being to drag the broken carcass of his plane home using nothing but his own hands. It was not technology that saved that pilot. It was redundancy. It was a refusal to die. The intercept ends with the sound of the A-10's landing gear locking into place. The Ghost had returned to base. In Moscow, the generals stare at the tape recorder. They are confused. They are frightened, because they know that no Soviet pilot would ever be expected to do that. No Soviet engineer would ever design a plane with a manual crank. They were looking for high-tech magic. They were looking for a secret shield. Instead, they found something far more dangerous. They found a culture of survival. And while the generals in Moscow were trying to understand the engineering, the soldiers on the ground were about to learn a much harsher lesson. They were about to meet the men who designed this machine. And they were about to discover that the manual reversion was just the beginning of the nightmare. The real secret was not how the plane survived. It was how it killed. To understand why the Soviet generals were trembling in 1991, we must leave the desert. We must travel back in time, back to the fluorescent-lit hallways of Arlington, Virginia, back to the 1970s. The irony of this story is painful. The Soviets believed the A-10 was a secret superweapon that the Americans had been saving for the apocalypse. They thought it was the crown jewel of the U.S. Air Force. They were wrong. The truth is that the U.S. Air Force hated this plane. They despised it. They tried to kill it before it was even born. In the late 60s, the Pentagon was a place obsessed with the space age. The generals wanted glamour. They wanted fighter jets that looked like spaceships. They wanted the F-15 Eagle and the F-14 Tomcat. Machines that could fly at twice the speed of sound. Machines that cost a fortune and looked beautiful on a recruitment poster. The philosophy was simple. Speed is life. If you fly fast enough, the enemy cannot kill you. But there was a problem. There was a ghost haunting the Pentagon, and that ghost was Vietnam. Deep in the basement of the Pentagon, a small group of analysts and engineers formed a secret society. They called themselves the Fighter Mafia. They looked at the data from the jungles of Vietnam, and they saw a tragedy. They saw young American pilots flying supersonic jets at 600 miles per hour, trying to drop bombs on enemies hiding under the trees. It was impossible. They were moving too fast to see the target. They were using a scalpel to chop down a tree. And when they slowed down to aim, their high-tech, multi-million-dollar jets were being shot out of the sky by peasants with simple rifles. The sleek aluminum skins of the jets were too thin. One bullet in the engine, and the pilot was dead. The fighter mafia realized a hard truth. The Air Force had forgotten how to fight dirty. They had forgotten that war is not about looking good. It is about mud and blood and survival. They decided to rebel. They drafted a requirement for a new plane. And what they wrote was an insult to every rule of modern aerodynamics. They did not ask for speed. They asked for a plane that was slow. They did not ask for high altitude. They asked for a plane that lived in the weeds. They did not ask for stealth. They asked for a plane that could get shot in the face and keep coming. This was the birth of the project known as AX. And when the engineers at Fairchild Republic took on the challenge, they made a decision that would change the history of warfare. They decided not to build a plane. They decided to build a gun. The Soviet analysts in Part 2 were confused by the holes in their tanks. They wondered what kind of weapon could punch through top armor with such violence. The answer is the GAU-8 Avenger. To call it a machine gun is an insult. It is a piece of artillery. Imagine a Volkswagen Beetle. Now imagine that car is made entirely of solid metal. That is the size and weight of the gun system inside the A-10. It weighs 4,000 pounds. It has 7 barrels. And the ammunition drum is the size of a cement mixer. The engineering challenge was a nightmare. The gun is so powerful that when it fires, it produces 10,000 pounds of recoil force. That is more thrust than one of the plane's engines. Think about that for a second. The gun pushes backward almost as hard as the engine pushes forward. If the engineers had mounted the gun under the wing like a normal plane, the recoil would have spun the aircraft out of the sky the moment the pilot pulled the trigger. So they did something crazy. They placed the gun exactly in the center. They drew a line down the middle of the fuselage, and they put the barrel right there. But where do you put the front landing gear? The gun is in the way. So they shoved the landing gear off to the side. If you look at an A-10 from the front, you will see it looks slightly lopsided. It is asymmetrical. They compromised the aerodynamics. They compromised the beauty, all to serve the gun. This confirms the Soviet suspicion. The A-10 is not a plane with a gun attached. It is a flying gun. But firepower was only half of the equation. The fighter mafia knew that to use this gun, the pilot had to get close, point-blank range. That meant flying directly into the teeth of the enemy guns. It meant flying into a storm of lead. So they came up with the second innovation, the one that truly baffled the Soviets, the titanium bathtub. In the modern age, armor was considered obsolete. It was heavy. It made planes slow. But the designers of the A-10 went back to the Middle Ages. They decided to build a suit of armor for the pilot. They took 1,200 pounds of titanium, the strongest metal known to man, and they forged it into a tub that surrounds the bottom and sides of the cockpit. The pilot sits inside this tub. It is his shield. It is his womb. While other pilots in their F-16s sat on top of their engines exposed and vulnerable, the A-10 pilot sat encased in metal. The glass in front of him is bulletproof. The belly beneath him can stop a high explosive shell. It was a design built on empathy. The engineers knew they were asking these men to do a dangerous job. They were asking them to fly at treetop level, so they made a promise in metal. We cannot promise you won't get hit, but we promise that if you get hit, we will bring you home. This philosophy of redundancy extended to every screw and bolt. They looked at the engines. In a normal jet, the engines are buried inside the body to make it aerodynamic. On the A-10, they mounted them high on the tail in separate pods. Why? so that if a heat-seeking missile hits one engine, it does not blow up the other one. They looked at the wings, they built them with a honeycomb structure. You can blow off half of the wing, you can tear off the tip, you can shred the skin, but the internal skeleton will hold. The Soviet military machine was built on the concept of the exchange ratio. They accepted that they would lose men. They accepted that soldiers were expendable resources like fuel or bullets. The American A-10 flipped this logic on its head. It placed an infinite value on the life of the single pilot. It was ugly. It was slow. The Air Force generals called it the Warthog because it was so hideous compared to their sleek fighters. They tried to cancel the program 3 times. They wanted to use the money to buy more fast jets. But the fighter mafia held the line. They knew a war was coming. And they knew that when the bullets started flying, nobody would care how pretty the plane was. And so in 1991, when the A-10 finally went to war, it was not just a machine entering the fight. It was a vindication. It was the triumph of the ugly duckling. And for the pilots who climbed into that titanium bathtub, it was the beginning of a love affair between man and machine that has no equal in the history of aviation. They were about to show the world what happens when you stop trying to be fast and start trying to be deadly. Let us return to the Iraqi desert. It is Sector 4, 3 days after the ground war has begun. The smoke has cleared, but the smell of burnt diesel and charred flesh hangs heavy in the air. It is a smell that sticks to the back of your throat. A team of Soviet military advisors disguised in nondescript fatigues steps out of a utility vehicle. They are here to conduct a post-mortem on a massacre. In front of them lies the twisted carcass of a T-72 tank. This machine was the pride of the Soviet export market. Its frontal armor was supposed to be impervious to standard NATO rounds. It was designed to fight across the plains of Germany. It was designed to shrug off hits from the American M60 or the German Leopard. But the advisor, a grim-faced colonel from the GRU, stares at the turret in disbelief. He runs his gloved hand over the steel. He is looking for the massive jagged tear caused by a high-explosive missile. He is looking for the scorch marks of a shaped charge. But they are not there. Instead, the tank looks like it has been attacked by a giant sewing machine. The steel plating is riddled with holes. They are small, about the size of a milk bottle, and they are perfectly round. The edges are smooth, almost polished. The colonel shines a flashlight into one of the holes. The beam of light goes straight through the thickest part of the armor, through the crew compartment, through the engine block, and exits out the rear, burying itself deep into the sand. "Kinetic energy," the colonel mutters to his aide. His voice is barely a whisper. No explosives, pure kinetic energy. He climbs onto the hull. He looks at the dispersion of the holes. They are grouped tightly, a pattern that suggests a weapon of terrifying accuracy and rate of fire. He calculates the angle. The attack came from above, but not from high altitude. A high-altitude strike would be a single, laser-guided bomb. This was a strafing run. "Who strafes a tank?" the aide asks, bewildered. "It is suicide. You have to fly straight and level. You make yourself a target for every gun on the ground." That is the central mystery that plagues the investigation. To achieve this kind of damage pattern, an aircraft has to fly low, under 1,000 feet. And slow. It has to point its nose directly at the tank for several seconds. In modern warfare, that is an eternity. That is enough time for a defensive gunner to put 500 rounds into the cockpit. But the Soviet colonel is about to learn the secret of the ammunition. The investigation team recovers a fragment from the sand. It is not lead. It is not steel. It is heavy, unnaturally heavy. It is depleted uranium. This is the moment the science of death becomes clear. The A-10 does not fire bullets. It fires fuel rods of dense, heavy metal. When a lead bullet hits a tank, it flattens. It mushrooms. But depleted uranium is different. It has a property called adiabatic shearing. As it punches through the armor, the metal peels away in such a way that the tip of the bullet actually gets sharper. It is a self-sharpening penetrator. And there is something else, something worse. When depleted uranium smashes through armor at supersonic speeds, the friction is so intense that the dust it creates catches fire. It is a pyrophoric effect. The colonel realizes with horror what happened to the crew inside this tank. They were not killed by an explosion. The bullet punched through the wall. It sprayed a mist of burning molten metal into the cabin. The pressure wave alone would have liquefied their internal organs. And then the burning dust would have ignited the fuel and ammunition. It was a death of absolute violence, instantaneous and total. The A-10 does not need to hit a specific weak point. It does not need to find the engine vent. It simply washes the tank in a stream of uranium. It is a laser beam of heavy metal. But the technical devastation is only half the story. The true power of the A-10 revealed itself in the eyes of the men who flew it. Let us shift our perspective. Let us climb into the cockpit. Meet Captain Eric Solomonson, call sign Fish. He is not sitting in a comfortable air-conditioned room. He is strapped into a titanium bathtub smelling of jet fuel and sweat. The vibration of the GAU-8 cannon runs through his spine like an electric current. It is the second day of the war. The weather is terrible. Sandstorms and oil smoke from burning wells have turned the day into night. The high-flying F-16 and F-15 are useless. Their laser designators cannot see through the smoke. They are circling at 20,000 feet, unable to help. But down below, a unit of U.S. Marines is pinned down. They are taking heavy fire. They are screaming on the radio. "We are taking casualties. We need air support now." Any rational pilot would stay high. The visibility is near zero. The ground is crawling with shoulder-fired missiles. But the A-10 pilots are different. They have a culture that borders on a religious cult. Their religion is the grunt, the soldier on the ground. Captain Solomonson does not check his fuel gauge. He does not check his radar. He pushes the stick forward. He drops down. Down through the clouds. Down through the smoke. He levels off at 50 feet above the ground. 50 feet. That is lower than the power lines. That is low enough to see the terror in the eyes of the enemy. He is flying on pure instinct. He is looking out the window, scanning for the muzzle flashes of the Iraqi tanks. He is doing something that hasn't been done since World War II. He is hunting with his eyes. "I see them," he says over the radio. "Danger close." Cleared hot. Danger close. It means the enemy is so close to the friendly troops that dropping a bomb would kill everyone. You need a scalpel. Solomonson banks the Warthog. The G-force pushes him into his seat. He lines up the crosshairs. He pulls the trigger. Brrrt! The gun roars. The plane shudders. Smoke engulfs the cockpit windshield. For a second, he is blind. Scene 35. But down on the ground, the Marines see a miracle. The Iraqi tank that was pinning them down simply disintegrates. One moment it is a threat. The next moment it is a burning wreck. The Marines cheer. They wave their helmets in the air. To them, that ugly, slow gray plane is the most beautiful thing in the world. It is an angel of death. This psychological impact is what the Soviet report failed to capture. The Soviet doctrine treated war as a game of numbers, but the A-10 brought fear back into the equation. Back at the interrogation centers in Saudi Arabia, Iraqi prisoners of war began to talk. These were battle-hardened men, soldiers of the Republican Guard. They had faced artillery, They had faced gas, but they were broken by the Warthog. "We do not fear the F-16, one prisoner told his interrogator, staring at the floor. "With the F-16, the bomb falls, and you are dead. It is fate. Allah wills it. But the cross," he shudders. "The cross is different. You hear the sound, the buzzing, and you know it is hunting you. It circles. It looks at you. It is personal." The prisoner explains the terrifying reality of the gun's acoustics. Because the bullets travel faster than the speed of sound, the target dies before he hears the gun. If you hear the brrrr-t sound, it means you are still alive. It means the bullets missed you. But it also means the plane is turning around. This psychological terror, the whispering death, broke the will of the Iraqi army faster than hunger or thirst. Tank crews started abandoning their vehicles at the first sound of a jet engine. They would rather walk across the desert than stay inside their steel coffins. The Soviet General Staff reading these transcripts in Moscow realized a devastating truth. The T-72 tank was dead. Not because it couldn't shoot, but because it had become a trap. No Soviet general could ever again confidently order a mass-armored advance without asking one terrifying question. Where are the Warthogs? The mystery of the ghost in the desert was solved. It wasn't a ghost, it was a predator. And the hunter had become the hunted. The end of the mystery arrives on the night of February 26, 1991. The location is Highway 80, a 6-lane stretch of pavement running from Kuwait City to the Iraqi border. History will remember it by a different name: the Highway of Death. As the Iraqi army collapses, thousands of vehicles flood onto this road. It is a river of steel. Stolen Mercedes-Benz cars mixed with T-72 tanks. School buses mixed with mobile missile launchers. They are desperate to escape. They are trying to run home. But they make a fatal mistake. They create a bottleneck. From the cockpit of an A-10 Warthog, looking down through the green glow of night vision goggles, the scene does not look like a war. It looks like a parking lot. The pilots call it a turkey shoot. But that phrase is too light. It does not capture the scale of the tragedy unfolding on the ground. The A-10s descend. They do not need to aim carefully. The target is everywhere. They line up on the road and they simply fly down the highway, holding the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon roars continuously. It is the sound of a giant zipper opening the fabric of the night. Down on the ground, panic sets in. The Iraqi soldiers, battle-hardened veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, look up. They see the explosions walking down the line toward them. They know that their armor is useless. They know that their trucks are death traps. So they do the only thing a human being can do when faced with a force of nature. They run. They open the doors and they run into the desert. They leave the engines running. They leave their weapons. They leave the stolen gold and the loot. They leave the pride of the Iraqi army burning on the asphalt. In Moscow, the satellite imagery arrives the next morning. The generals in the Ministry of Defense look at the photos. They are horrified. They see miles of destruction. It looks like the aftermath of a nuclear strike, but without the radiation. It is absolute. It is total. This is the moment the Soviet Union realizes that its military philosophy is obsolete. But the true shock comes a few weeks later when the final statistics of the war are compiled. This is the report that acts as the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Empire. The Soviet doctrine relied on a concept called acceptable losses. They assumed that in a war with NATO, for every 10 tanks they lost, they would shoot down 1 or 2 enemy planes. They believed they could win by simply having more tanks than the Americans had missiles. The report on the desk of Marshal Yazov destroys this assumption. It destroys the math of the Cold War. During the conflict, the fleet of A-10 Warthogs, the obsolete aircraft, the slow target, conducted over 8,000 sorties. They fired nearly 800,000 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition. The result? They destroyed 987 tanks. They destroyed nearly 1,200 artillery pieces. They obliterated over 2,000 military vehicles. And the cost? The Americans lost only 6 A-10s to enemy fire. The generals stare at the numbers. The ratio is not 10 to 1. It is nearly 165 to 1. For every single Warthog brought down, an entire armored regiment was wiped off the map. This is the killer statistic. This is the economic reality that ends empires. A T-72 tank costs millions of rubles to build. It requires a crew of 3 men who need to be fed and trained. It requires fuel. It requires maintenance. It is a massive investment of national treasure. And it was being dismantled by a 3-second burst of cannon fire that cost less than a standard civilian car. The economic asymmetry is devastating. The Soviets realize in that cold room that they cannot win an economic war against an enemy that can destroy their most expensive assets with such cheap, brutal efficiency. It is August 1991. The coup against Mikhail Gorbachev is brewing. The Soviet Union is crumbling from within. The shops are empty. The people are angry. But the military report on the A-10 acts as a silent structural failure deep within the psyche of the state. For 40 years, the Soviets chased the Americans in the high-tech race. When the Americans built the B-1 bomber, the Soviets built the Blackjack bomber. When the Americans built the F-15, the Soviets built the Su-27. They were obsessed with parity. They were obsessed with looking advanced. They were obsessed with prestige. But the A-10 proved that the Americans possessed something the Soviets lacked: the capacity for specialized divergent thinking. The Soviet system was rigid. A top-down hierarchy decided what weapons were needed. If the general secretary liked fast planes, everyone built fast planes. There was no room for a group of rebels to push through an ugly, slow aircraft like the Warthog. In the Soviet system, the A-10 would have been canceled at the drawing board for being regressive, for looking like a step backward. The Americans, however, allowed a mistake like the A-10 to survive because it worked. Their system, chaotic and competitive, allowed the ugly duckling to find its place. The Soviets realized they had been beaten not by a microchip, but by a philosophy. They had been beaten by the American willingness to be pragmatic, to be ugly, to be effective. This realization creates a crisis of confidence in the Kremlin. The phone lines to the Soviet arms export agency Rosoboronexport go silent. Syria, Libya, North Korea. They all watched the same footage on CNN. They saw the burning T-72 tanks. They saw the Iraqi army modeled entirely on Soviet doctrine, surrendering to drones and helicopters. Who would buy a Soviet tank now? The A-10 had single-handedly devalued the Soviet Union's primary export. It turned their gold into lead. As the sun sets on the Soviet Empire, the generals are left with a bitter taste in their mouths. They had spent decades preparing for the wrong war. They built a shield to stop a sword, but the enemy brought a sledgehammer. And as the red flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the final time in December 1991, the ghost of the desert. The ugly, slow Warthog is still flying. It is the ultimate symbol of their defeat. A machine that should not have worked, destroying an army that should not have lost. The empire was dead, but the Warthog was just getting started.